We'll get this done.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm hoping.
I love my little thing.
Finalized list.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Hello. And welcome. We're glad that you're able to join us today for Digital Black Feminism, or the Black Feminist Technical from Dr. Catherine Knight Steele. This event is hosted by the Center for Information, Technology, and Public Life at the University of North Carolina as part of our Spring Speaker Series. I'm Catherine Peters, BCaT's Executive Director. BCaT. At BCaT, we are dedicated to understanding the growing impact of the internet, social media, and other forms of digital information in the context of the design, use, and govern them. We're especially interested in studying people, platforms, and power. Our research takes a holistic approach to studying technology, focusing on how social inequality and power structures shape the use, deployment, and impact of technologies. We're committed to equality and justice in our scholarship, teaching, and dissemination of research. In that spirit, I'd like to take a moment with you today to consider the legacy of colonization in our technology and society. Our center occupies the ancestral land of many Native peoples, including the Shakori, Eno, Tuscarora, and Lumbee, and remains home today to the Occaneechi Band. The University of North Carolina was funded in its early years by the sale of lands home to the Cherokee and Chickasaw Nation. And I invite you to join me in acknowledging our shared responsibility in our time today to recognize. We are honored to be hosting Dr. Catherine Knight Steele. After the talk, we'll hold a Q&A session. For those of you who are joining us remotely, you can submit questions to ctap@unc.edu. To introduce our speaker, I'll hand our microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Dean Freelon, associate professor here in the Hussman School of Journalism and Media, and a principal investigator at CTAP.
All right, thank you very much. Those of you who know me know that I don't need a microphone, so I'll just project like I normally do. My great privilege to introduce to you today Dr. Catherine Knight Steele, who is an assistant professor of communication at the University of Maryland, College Park. She serves as the director of the Black Communication and Technology Lab, which is funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and part of the DISCO Network. Her research focuses race, gender, and media with a specific focus on Black culture, discourse, and digital communication. Dr. Steele was the founding director of the first African American Digital Humanities Initiative, which was also funded by the Mellon Foundation, and it fostered research, education, and training at the intersections of digital humanities and African American studies, and prepared a diverse community of scholars and students whose work has broadened the reach of digital humanities and African American history and cultural studies, rich humanities research with new methods, archives, and tools. Dr. Steele's book, Digital Black Feminism, builds on her decades-long research into the Black blogosphere of the 2000s as sites which replicated features of Black oral culture in order to engage with discourse and see it equally. Stop there, there's a lot more. I'm sure Dr. Steele will be happy to tell us about. So thank you very much. Please begin your talk.
Thank you so much.
So thank you so much for having me. It is really a distinct privilege and pleasure to be here. I am excited, and I have to say this, I'm excited even though in the year 2005, the University of North Carolina Tar Heels defeated my beloved Illini in the last final round of the NCAA tournament, and I will never forgive you. But I will today put that aside in order to say that I'm really delighted to be here, and it's quite wonderful. I hope this talk is, I wasn't aware before I got here, this is finals week, that some of you are attending commencement today. So I'm extraordinarily grateful that you took time out to come to the talk. And I want to say, I hope the talk provides a brief respite from the other obligations and duties that you have to encounter when you leave this space. I, of course, though, want to recognize those for whom this talk isn't a respite, but is additional labor. And so I'm very appreciative to Katie Peters, who worked to make arrangements for this, for the IT and tech support, who came in to make sure that the room was functional, for the folks who do things like make flyers and make arrangements for people to travel and process honoraria and clean the spaces that we use on our university campuses, whose names I don't know, but whose labor I see and I appreciate. I begin every talk by acknowledging that labor because I think it is so important that we recognize what a unique and specific privilege it is to sit in rooms and talk about ideas, and that those kinds of conversations are only made possible by the labor that is done that is often not appreciated, and that hopefully we use that as an opportunity to take the opportunity and to create more opportunities to be in solidarity with folks whose labor make our jobs possible as well. And I think that labor is actually a really interesting way to start out this talk. I was reflecting about this a bit yesterday because I attended a dissertation prospectus of a particularly brilliant student who is writing about gaming culture and social movements at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, thinking about things like Fortnite and Animal Crossing, and was aptly reminding us of all of the labor that was involved for content creators during that period of time and what that looked like as we were reflecting kind of in a nostalgic way about the fun that we were having during that period. So labor. I begin thinking in this book, Digital Black Feminism, about labor, about Black women's labor. And I was dead set when I wrote this book on making sure that that would not be actually the focus of the text, that I would not make Black women laborers for the entirety of the project. But frankly, it's very difficult to write about Black women and our history in the United States and our relationship to technology without thinking first about labor. There are phrases like listen to Black women and ask Black women that became really popular, specifically after the election of the 45th president. Because at that moment, when exposed to the same rhetoric and often living in similar economic circumstances as their peers, Black women made a different choice in that election period that was pretty notable by the press. Black women voted for the 45th president in lower numbers than any other racial and gender demographic. And so that phrase, listen to Black women, got adopted by activists and politicians and organizers and journalists who are all pointing to both Black women's voting record, but also our labor record in organizing, in bringing out the vote. And there was this common phrase that popped up on Twitter, right, where people were saying Black women are trying to save America from itself. The problem with these popular hashtags and phrases is that they don't actually do much of the work of explaining how centuries of wisdom and labor and ingenuity have put Black women in a continuous position to have to do that work of trying to save America from itself. So as is the case with many of these hashtagable lines and phrases like listen to Black women, they do very little but virtue signal without any requirement of follow-through. Follow-through in terms of Black feminist praxis and principles. One of the principles that I write about in this text are complicated allegiances, or the idea that digital Black feminism foregrounds our need to build not long-term but short-term temporal agreements with folks outside of our communities in order, or even with institutions or companies, to achieve small goals. There's a quick story about this. I remember being asked to give a talk a few years ago as a part of a group of plenary speakers for an event that had this term feminism in its title. They were lauding feminist leaders in technology. I was really pleased to be at that talk, really excited about the folks that I was on that plenary with. And one of those folks, a white woman colleague, pulled me aside during the luncheon because she suspected that there was a pay discrepancy between what I was offered to give the talk and what she was offered to give the talk. My labor, it seemed, was not as valuable as hers. And I can't tell you how often this happens. And I also don't ever know if it's bound up in my race and in my gender alone. But what I do know is I appreciate those allegiances, those complicated allegiances of colleagues to pull me aside and remind me that it is valuable, my labor, and that institutions and colleges and consortia that produce statements and suggest that we listen to Black women also must pay Black women for their time, their energy, and yes, their labor. So that's kind of an aside about labor, but I think it's an important introduction to thinking about digital Black feminism, which I will let you know was a labor. Writing a book is very much a labor, and it is one that I enjoy, though, as well. So labor, though, it's a part of my job. It's a part of me working toward tenure. But it also was a delight. And the thing that was most delightful to me and surprising, I think, was the way that digital Black feminism required me to move through histories, presents, and futures. For many digital scholars, our training is not historical. Our training is in presentist ideas. We unfortunately sometimes start to think that things begin and end with the internet. So I instead in this talk would like to walk you through a past, a present, and a future. So in thinking through the past, I'd like to first start out by thinking about this idea of technology and how, I think my clicker is working, there it is, okay, thanks. What is a technology? When I talk to groups that are not so technologically inclined, I'll do this kind of back and forth where they'll provide definitions and we'll go through when did we first learn about this. But I'll ask you instead to just think about when your first introduction to that term happened and what kinds of ideas come to mind when you think about what a technology is. How did you come to understand then who holds technological expertise and how much of that is tied to the very limited box through which, and the very limited lens through which we start to understand what constitutes technology. And then finally, who gets to be an expert within that framework? I walked down that path in the book partly because I sit with the rhetoricians in my department and they care very deeply about language. And so I start to care very, very deeply about language and how these terms come to be and how they matter. I also will credit Andy Rajecki, who required us to do a lot of operationalizing of terms in graduate school, and I spent, I think, an entire semester trying to figure out what the term religiosity actually means, and didn't end up writing the paper that was supposed to be based on it. But I think what that taught me was the importance of our terms having real meaning in terms of how we contextualize the kind of work we're going to do. So technology and what comes to constitute a technology matters in so much as who gets left out of the history and the narrative of who develops technological expertise and then who gets to hold it in a presentist sense. But Pat Hill-Collins provides us a really good way of thinking about this when she suggests that there is a shadow, a complex shadow, that obscures Black women's intellectual tradition. She's not talking about technology here, but I would argue that the complex intellectual tradition regarding Black women and technology is likewise obscured, and that it's neither accidental nor benign. It doesn't come to be out of a series of unfortunate events. It comes to be out of a series of intentional events that have separated Black folks more broadly and Black women more specifically from our notion of what it means to be a technological expert. So for most of our short 300-year history in this country, it's a rather new country, our focus has been on this idea of efficiency, progress, and democracy. That has been the master narrative of how the US has come to be. And what's kind of wild, if you think about it, is that within that master narrative of efficiency and progress and democracy, the folks most responsible for building the country very frequently get left out of that master narrative. Marginalized groups' expertise and experiences are not often talked about. And what's more, the written record that is kept and maintained by Black women doesn't exist. So how do we go back through an archival past and locate Black women in the history of technology when Black women were not allowed to write, tell, and keep those stories? I would argue that we have to examine the use of Black women's technology between the lines within the historical record. And I set out to do that by trying to locate a space within US history where Black women were unquestionably the purveyors of technology, without the watchful eye of the dominant group, where those technologies were used almost exclusively by and for Black women, and where Black women were trusted and sought after for their expertise. I would argue we have to really begin with this space because it's, I think, the only way for us to begin to recognize Black women's expertise elsewhere. If we begin in a space where Black women are unquestionably centered, then we can start to see Black women's experience in other places. We have to remove the blinders and the lenses that have caused us to erase Black women from our concept of technology, of skill, and expertise. And we have to undo both the assumed deficiency and ineptitude that society has bestowed upon Black women as it relates to technology. So, where do I locate this space? The beauty shop. I built an analytic called the virtual beauty shop in order to provide us a new lens through which to understand the layered complexity of Black feminist technoculture. You all hosted Andre Brock here just a few weeks ago, and I'll build on one of the definitions that he has in his book, which is about Black cyberculture. Brock labels Black cyberculture as a digital practice and artifact informed by a Black aesthetic. And he differentiates Black cyberculture from a broader notion of technoculture, defining the latter as a combination of whiteness and modern technological beliefs. He argues that Black cyberculture instead arises from the aesthetic and the libidinal. So Black cyberculture ultimately reflects Black folks' ability to interject pleasure and joy into their experience with technology from a Black experience, one that's too often usually determined by others as being about pain and deprivation. And I think that this critical interjection by Brock provides a really valuable starting point because it separates Black cultural production from white cyberculture. So I tried to build upon this logic a bit, asserting that digital Black feminism then might be uniquely suited to undercut the reach and the power of white men's cyberculture. Black women's unique experience with both oppression and resistance shapes the ability to understand and utilize communication technologies both in an analog and a digital fashion. So if white technoculture, according to Brock, is built on white ideology, patriarchy, and misogyny, Black feminist technoculture is its undoing. It also requires us to see Black women as central not only to the present, but to the past and the future as it relates to technology. So let's think about the beauty shop briefly and how I think this metaphor allows us to think about a transference from a physical space to a digital culture and how it helps us understand the possibilities and constraints of a digital technology and its environment. So I'll start out by reminding us of something, which is that Black feminism is not reactive to white feminism, though your history books may suggest otherwise. It predates it because before white feminists began fighting for voting rights or the right to work or bodily autonomy, Black women, as Toni Morrison writes, had nothing to fall back on, not maleness, not whiteness, not ladyhood, not anything, and out of a profound desolation of reality, we may well have invented ourselves. So what the beauty shop allows us to do is to move Black women from the margins of our conversation about feminism to the center point. It allows us to ask a different set of questions that don't assume whiteness at the center of feminist thought. And when Black women are at the center of feminist thought, it's operating from a different perspective. Because Black feminism in the early Americas was already operating through the insurgent action of Black enslaved folks. It was already operating for folks who were fighting slaveholders for their freedom while caring and attending to families and asserting agency over their bodies. Black enslaved women were fighting white supremacy through their love for each other and for other Black men. Brittany Cooper reminds us that the race women of the 19th and 20th century were crafting rhetorical campaigns that asserted their freedom. But the key here is that Black feminist freedom work was not rooted in a desire to wield power that was taken from Black men or from white women. Instead, the aim of Black feminist work from the early part of colonial America to now is that it is revolutionary, emancipatory freedom from the confines of hegemonic power structures altogether. So I assert that the virtual beauty shop allows us this mechanism to see a metaphor where Black women are already positioned at the center. It reminds us that it is possible for us to restructure our notion of what constitutes feminism by not deferring to whiteness as standard or normative. The second piece of why I think the beauty shop functions as a great metaphor for thinking about a Black feminist technoculture is really about hair, and thinking about Black hair care as a technology itself. Whether we're talking about braids or weaves, whether we're talking about the appropriation and the history of survival strategies that Black women engage in order to do one another's hair, braiding, doing hair reminds us of the skill sets, of the mechanisms, of the actual technological expertise that is embedded both within the mind and fingertips of Black women. Andrea Rose Clark has a really lovely quote, and I don't do justice without just going ahead and letting y'all read it, because I don't say it quite as well as she does. But she reminds us that braiding is really a technology with a rule structure that's kind of like an algorithm. She talks about how tools perform aesthetic gestures, and that these present commands and algorithms, the execution and repetition of a series of procedures and patterns that we see as braid, is a closed system of rules that allows for variable patterns to evolve. What I love about this quote is that rather than focusing on the end result of what's produced when someone braids hair, rather than talking about the hair itself, which is often how Black hair gets discussed, right? Or how it gets taken up, or how it gets appropriated. Andrea Rose Clark is reminding us of the praxis or the procedure of doing Black hair. She's reshifting the attention to the action and activity of it, and the reminder that it requires not just some innate ability, but an acquired skill, a technique, and expertise in order to engage it. And so the beauty shop then provides us this test to understand that Black women's expertise is something that is cultivated over time, just as any other expertise is located. Patrice Gaskins provides us something really similar here in thinking about rating as a mechanism of algorithmic modeling, suggesting that certain patterns are amenable or open to algorithmic modeling, but amenable need not denote the simple. A square is easier to simulate and repeat, but the process of braiding, knitting, and weaving these shapes is about the complexity that arrives from simplicity. So the second piece of this Black feminist technoculture is a focus on technique and expertise, and how we see that technique and expertise translate from an analog or physical space like a beauty shop to a digital space. Where do we see elements of these kinds of techniques and expertise made manifest in Black women's spaces online, like the blogosphere? How do we see Black women taking up tools and techniques and technologies that center Black women's work, that rely heavily into Black women's labor and skills in order to make sites more profitable, do the work on existing sites and platforms like Twitter and Facebook through content moderation that the sites themselves are not willing to engage in, but that Black women develop expertise in order to manage, and therefore not only manage themselves and their own business sensibilities, but the site itself. The third piece of this, of the Black feminist technoculture, is then one of entrepreneurship. And what we understand from an analog to a digital space here are the ways that Black women entrepreneurs in the beauty shop have historically had to function separately from the rest of the economy, have built businesses within their homes without access to small business loans or apprenticeships, and instead have utilized skill sets like marketing and branding and figuring out how to build small businesses collectively on their own without access to these tools. Much of the same way that we found early Black women influencers doing online, platforms like Instagram, and predating that in places like the blogs, where they would take up these small communities of readership and create sustainable business models for themselves. I'll talk about a couple of these in just a moment, from experiences like Lovia J.E., who has built her own site, her own platform, her own production processes, or Kevin Sage. There's lots of examples of folks who have done this over the years. The fourth reason that I point to the beauty shop as a potential metaphor for us to understand Black women's digital culture is about the enclave. The enclave, as Catherine Squires kind of explains to us, is a way of understanding the gathering places that are subaltern counterpublics, to quote Nancy Fraser, but instead don't function in counterpublic senses, meaning they're not in constant conversation with the dominant group. That we have enclave spaces where Black women gather to do the work and the labor of drafting rhetorical principles and practices that allow them to remain safe, that allow them to remain profitable, to allow them to pay their own bills, but to do so in a place that is safe from the dominant group. So what we see here in that functionality that moves from offline to online are things like a high context for participation, an internal way of knowing. That is very common within a beauty shop atmosphere, but also within the digital enclaves that folks are forming online. So how do we take what I think is perhaps a promising or a useful metaphor and bring in some more theory to actually understand what undergirds a Black feminist technoculture? There's three folks that I would point to that help build this premise of a Black feminist technoculture. The first is Pat Till Collins' work on the matrix of domination. The second is Joan Morgan's Hip Hop Feminism. And the third is Anna Everett. I'll explain really briefly before moving on, because I think it's important. I focus on the matrix of domination. I kind of like this term. A lot of other folks use intersectionality from Crenshaw. These are very similar concepts, of course. For those of us who study intersectionality and study Black feminist thought, we kind of know what's come of intersectionality online in the last few years. And it's the reason why I'm continually drawn to the matrix of domination as a really useful term. And the reason is, for one, it's really hard to do things with the term matrix of domination that you didn't intend to do. It's not a nice term, right? It can't just mean any old thing that you want it to mean. It means what it means. She said what she said. And so I really am still drawn to matrix of domination. The other reason I am is that it evokes this visual element for me of a matrix, right? Of these interlocking ideas, of the complicated ways that systems surround and interlock around the lives of Black women. Because matrices often contain these multiple elements that aren't immediately visible, right? The pieces have to be kind of pulled apart. They're interconnected and reliant on each other in order to build the larger notion of what the whole is. And a matrix also has these cracks in it, right, that allow the light to kind of shine through. The cracks in that matrix also allow us to see how a system can be torn to pieces. If provides this really brilliant foundation for digital culture, right? Which I think very brilliantly often hides its oppressive forces within those interlocking elements. Joan Morgan's hip hop feminism is also incredibly useful to me because what Joan Morgan puts forward in the late 1990s and early 2000s is this moment to mark a shift in Black feminist thought. And her argument about that shift is that there are cultural things that necessarily change our political orientations. That Black women's relationship with hip hop, by necessity, was going to change how they related to Black feminism. So she began arguing for what she called a Black feminist thought that fucked with the grays, the gray areas of life, that things couldn't be quite so black and white anymore. That I could simultaneously love hip hop and hate misogynoir, even though the two seem to be walking step in step. That a Black woman who learned how to function in the world surrounded by hip hop could also advocate fiercely for equity and equality. And so I turn to hip hop feminism as kind of a roadmap for how we think about Black women's relationship with the digital. Because there's a very similar kind of thing happening where Black women are growing up in digital spaces, who are writing there, whose entertainment with pop culture happens there, but who also first come to read about Black feminism perhaps online. Online, though, is also where they experience some of the worst harassment and violence in their day-to-day lives. So digital culture simultaneously has to hold the harms and the victory. It has to hold the possibilities for our economic entrepreneurship and be the place where people steal and appropriate from us constantly. Being a Black feminist online necessitates the fucking with the grays. The third point is Anna Everett and Black technophilia. And for those who read Anna Everett's book back in 2009, this was way ahead of its time, right? This is a book that is prompting us to move a public from an almost near obsession with Black deviance and technophobia to Black technophilia, or the idea that Black folks aren't deficient in their technology use. Instead, we are technophilic. We are vanguards. Brock has referred to this as a natural affinity. Ray Fouché has said that Black folks exhibit a Black vernacular technological creativity. But what Everett ultimately gives us with this notion of Black technophilia is a lens through which we can understand Black folks generally, but Black women more specifically in our use of technology without any notion of deviance or deficiency. Instead, beginning with the principle that what we're doing is creative, it is more than magical, it is skillful, and it is expertise. So together, these three ideas, the matrix of domination, this idea of hip hop feminism, and Black technophilia, walk us into, I think, a possibility for understanding Black feminist technoculture. What's more, I think this brief walk through the past that we just engaged in points to why it's important to still look at the gaps in the archive as digital researchers. Why researchers of digital technology cannot begin with the taken for granted histories that are provided to us, even when we're doing presentist research. Focus on history will help us become better technologists. They also lay the groundwork for the principles, the praxis, and the product, which is the way that I organized the book to think about this primary argument, that there is in fact a Black feminist technoculture, that it has been present in these United States for multiple centuries, and that pointing us ourselves toward that is perhaps the only possibility for us to understand the possibilities and constraints of our future technology. So we talked about the past. I'm going to more quickly walk through the present and the future. And to talk about the present, I'm actually going to shift over to method, which is one of my favorite, weirdly, things to talk about. I know people don't like talking about method, but I'm going to talk about method anyway. In this book, I move between methods, between empirical data analysis, critical cultural work, and rhetorical criticism, because what I ultimately had to figure out was how do you marry archival work with online data collection? Can we and should we be applying similar strategies to a correspondence written by Anna Julia Cooper in 1898 that we do to a tweet written by Jamila Mew in 2019? So I would say any strategy that we use to study a Black feminist technoculture or a technoculture of your choice must situate the text both historically and contextually. It must be focused, I would argue, on the people that use those texts and not simply the tools themselves. I'm asking us instead to think about the relationship that people form with their tools. And I think a method or a strategy like this has to see the artifacts that folks leave behind, both in 1898 and in 2019, as simultaneously belonging to multiple genres or areas of study. When we're just using our technology, for those of us who are on social media and use Twitter or Instagram or any other app on a regular basis, it's kind of intuitive to us that we might be using that tool differently than someone else is at a given moment, right? That there are folks who are indeed mass media content creators on Twitter, right? They are creating intentional content for mass distribution. But at the same time, there are folks using that app to send direct messages in an interpersonal context to someone else. We also know that there are folks who are using it as a form of public address, while at the same time, there are folks who are using it to capture something that's more like a diary or a memoir, keeping track of their day-to-day activities. We know that. They're fashioning their own archives sometimes. But as researchers, we have this tendency to flatten that experience into one way of interacting with our technology, one approach. And that flattening really tends to happen because it's easier. It's actually much easier to treat Twitter as one way of interacting, or Instagram as another way of interacting, so we can use one method to study it and actually get our projects done. I mean, but we have to remind ourselves that that's not how people are engaging. It's easier to do that with historical texts because our beloved archivists have already done that work for us. They've put documents into categories called correspondence and memoirs and pamphlets. And so when we come to those texts as rhetoricians or historians, right, what we're doing is suggesting there is a way to study how someone writes to a friend. There's a way to think about that. There are certain questions that are appropriate. And there's a very different way to think about the public speeches that that person gave. But why aren't we doing that same thing with our tools of online technology, right? How can we start to be more aware of how individuals are using our tools differently at different times? And I would argue that it requires a combining of method of discursive analysis with the study of platform and affordance, with critical cultural work and rhetorical criticism, of what some might call an ethnographic approach or participant observation. And I'll bring forward Brock just one more time to highlight CTDA and suggest that I think this is a method that starts to get at this, right? That requires us, critical technocultural discourse analysis, to look at the same platform in different ways in different moments in order to understand how the user is interpolating themselves in that space, right? I won't do a large explanation of CTDA. I'll trust that Dre did that a couple weeks ago and that you all are all set on that for now. But I would say that to study a Black feminist technoculture in the present, I begin to treat those social media posts and technologies of right now similarly to how I treat the memoirs and letters and diaries that were left by Black women for us some 100 plus years ago. I start with an ethic of care for the texts and for the people that write them. All the blogs that I read over the last 10 years, I was there when the post first happened. All of the tweets that I studied in this book, I watched them as they came across my page the day that they were written. I saw who responded to them and when. I saw when folks were in the midst of a conversation but didn't use a hashtag in order to orient it because that conversation wasn't for everyone. It was for who they were talking to. And you could only know who they were talking to by being a part of that conversation as it was happening. That's the level of time and care that we bring to the archive, even when we're not intending to, but that we can also bring back to these social media posts. I can't be in the archive when these things happen. I wasn't there when Anna Julia Cooper wrote a letter to Oberlin demanding that her work be published, but I can treat her words like they require the same amount of context that I am seeking out from my online participants. I can lose myself so deeply in archives and in the letters and pages of documents that I begin to forget the question that I was asking in a similar way that I do as I'm scrolling along my For You page on a TikTok on any given evening, right? And the question will come if I lose myself there long enough. So this is how we do this. We can make transferences from offline texts to online. We can take the best sensibilities that rhetorical criticism and digital ethnography and critical cultural studies bring to these spaces, and we can interweave them in ways that actually do justice to not only the texts themselves, but the people that produce them. And when we do that, we can start to think about our own experience in being a part of that notion of capture. I argue that in order to study Black feminist technoculture, you have to form a relationship with this idea of capture. In the book Barracoon, Zoriel Hurston writes she interviews Cujo Lewis, who was one of the last surviving people to cross the transatlantic in the slave trade. And in 1927, when she interviews him, he details his capture and his life that follows in the U.S. But Hurston then also goes on back to her hometown in Eatonville to try to capture some of her own life history and some of the larger Black folk stories of the South. The word capture, I find, is always indicative of power. Who has the power to capture? Who is captured? What do they choose to capture? And ultimately, what becomes of the captured and the capturer? Pat Hill Collins' Matrix of Domination reminds us of its dominant group's long-standing relationship with capture and control and distribution of images of Black women. But work like Lovia Jay's online also reminds us that Black women have a very unique relationship with capture that is supplemented by their relationship with digital technology. On the screen are just 3 examples of how Lovia Jay, a blogger who goes on to own her own social media platforms, writes about her way on 3 different platforms, on Twitter, on Instagram, and on Facebook. And it might be a little bit hard to see the text here, but you can see the visual changes greatly as she talks about this same lived experience across platforms. Why does this matter? Well, it gives us some sensibility into the way that Black women are choosing to capture and then sell the image of themselves back to a public. The awareness that they have of the different affordances of different platforms that do different work. That on certain platforms, the capture of the self is about realness and authenticity. And on other platforms, it's about branding and marketing, right? And that she's working and navigating between these platforms, showing off her skill set, yes, but also showing off this really complicated relationship that she has with capture, where she's fully aware that she doesn't own these images anymore. She's fully aware that by placing them on these sites, she's actually making money for other folks. But she's also fully aware that by utilizing these platforms, she can supplement some of that money back to herself through the selling of her books and her merchandise and all these other items. And so often we're assuming that folks who are engaging in this practice are unaware of their participation in this system of capital. I would suggest that it's a little bit more nuanced and complex than that. And so I'll finish by talking about that complexity, by thinking about the future. I want to talk about how the lessons of a Black feminist technoculture online give us both the possibilities and constraints for our digital world. And I want to do that by talking about pizza. Because pizza gives us a really great example of how this looks in real time. On the left up here, you see an image of Akilah Hughes. Akilah Hughes is a comedian who in 2015 did a web video called Intersectionality Pizza. And in that video, Hughes described men as burgers and women as pizza, with cheese pizza being the stand-in for white women and deluxe pizza being the stand-in for Black women. And she described Black women's exclusion from mainstream white feminist thought and the additional burdens that Black women faced as they advocated for their freedom. But she did all of this while discussing pizza topping. And she did it in such an interesting way, and in such a way that was a short, digestible content of a bite that mainstream news picked it up. The video went viral, it circulated about the internet, people were using it on late night cable news shows, but they were also beginning to use it in classrooms. Because, I mean, she did it without alienating anyone. Americans like pizza, and we like burgers. And unlike pizza and burgers, the people, the people they're meant to represent, pizza and burgers don't hold any responsibility. Right? Pizza and burgers are these inanimate objects that we can kind of post blame on. But when we do that, when we take these really complex ideas and we make them into these hashtags and we make them into bite-sized chunks that students will pay attention to, it's tempting to embrace and even encourage this recirculation of their use. And I would say that intersectionality pizza does provide us a really attractive metaphor for students. But again, as we started out talking about buzzwords and highly viral content, it works because it's not controversial. Right? It's actually kind of hard to circulate real in-depth conversation about intersectionality because it would require more than 30 seconds. It would require some more deep engagement, and it would make us deeply uncomfortable because that's what its purpose is to do. So this commodification process can take and provide superficial access to complex theory that culminates in a really watered-down product that's palatable to a larger, broader audience. And what's more, this kind of commodification, this kind of superficiality and watering down is part of a long arc of commodification of critical Black feminist thought and concepts that leads to, I would argue, the commodification of actual people. In the text, I talk about this in relationship to Cardi B and how her image and her personage becomes an object that folks kind of manifest their own ideas upon and utilize in order to practice their idea of Black feminism. So we started with labor, and I think it's probably fitting that we conclude there. I end the book thinking about Black feminist labor, Black women's labor, how Black women should be paid for their work, but also how being beholden to a digital economy makes every activity get classified as labor, how our personage gets defined in terms of how much labor we produce, and our ideas get packaged as commodities for sale. So this is the part where I urge us to have some caution about what a future in digital technology looks like, where we are beholden to this commodification process, and what a future for Black feminist thought looks like when we are beholden to commodifying our ideas and selling and packaging them for larger, broader consumption. That is an incredibly depressing way to end a talk, but let's do that anyway and then move into some Q&A. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that talk. Gosh, the ideas are just popping in my head faster than I can process them. So, but I do want to offer anyone the opportunity to ask a question. You know, normally what I do in these situations is to allow folks to sort of raise their hands and ask questions. And then during the inevitable lulls in question asking, I will exert my moderator privilege to ask the questions that I have. So, please, go right ahead, ask your questions.
Good to see you. I'm a guest in the school today, so I'm the historian from Black Studies. But first, I just want to say thank you for your work. But I'm also here because I've benefited from the many institutes that Catherine has created, and so I just want to shout that out. I was really struck by many things in the talk. But I introduced myself as a historian because I think a lot about, as you know, coming to your institute, thinking about how to bring technology and these kind of conversations in the classroom. And so I was struck by a number of moves that you made, talking about the archives, talking specifically about tools that Andrea Cooper used, contextualizing that, but then ending talking about commodification. And I think about that a lot when I think about digital research tools. And I'm just sort of curious how you're thinking about that in the conversation of commodification. I mean, you were talking about it with regard to Twitter, et cetera, but also in terms of accessing information and how people access it through the archives when there's paywalls up, et cetera. And does that play a role in sort of the digital reality?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question, and thank you for your work. I mean, I often say we met during the African American Digital Humanities Initiative at Maryland, and I often say that my work in that initiative, I'm not a historian, but I'm really glad they let me play with them, is that it changed what I thought was important to write about. It changed my procedure for doing the book, and so I'm like deeply grateful for the humanists, the historians, the literature scholars, push my thinking in a lot of ways on this. So your question about how technology can become limiting in terms of our access points is one that's really interesting because a lot of the archival work that I did for this book, most of it happened online. Most of these folks have digital archives. Angela Cooper, Zora Neale Hurston, right? Folks who have digitized a lot of these pages for us to have access. I was fortunate to be able to go as well. But I think about the dual relationship that we have with that kind of a procedure. Because for one, it does allow this kind of access point that many of us can't travel to the archive. I have graduate students who are looking for funding right now to do archival work, and they can't find it, and they can't get to those spaces. But there is something about touching the document that becomes really a big part of how we interact with what folks left behind for us. I'll give an example, which is a pamphlet from Ida B. Wells that I'm not sure if I even made it into the book, but there was a pamphlet that it was a program rather for a children's fund in Chicago that she was attending some fundraiser for. And like in the margins, she was writing part of her memoir, and the part of the memoir that she was writing was about deciding to not have kids. And that wasn't digitized. Like, you couldn't capture that there, right? I had to see how you would flip it over. And while she was looking at this children's program, there was this flip over and this notation to the self about this idea. I'm like really grateful someone has that. But I also think about that in relationship to what we're archiving now, what we don't have access to. So to do this work with the blogs and the Twitter accounts and the Instagram accounts, folks often ask, like, what was my digital archive like, and am I going to share that? Like, am I going to make that public? And the answer resoundingly now is no. At the start, it's like, I don't know, maybe I should. But I'll tell you why, no, if you want to. But the thing about it is what worried me and why I thought the book was important to write was there's a lot of history that has already been and is being lost about what's happening. So the early part of the blogosphere has not been captured well, for example, in a lot of our writing about the internet. That was a stage of work, especially with the Black blogosphere, that just got jumped over to Twitter. Twitter became a much more interesting thing for people to write about. It became a much more lucrative thing for folks to write about. And so what becomes important is that there are some things that folks deem worthy of capturing because they are profitable. Like capturing Twitter data is profitable to a lot of people. Profitable in terms of our careers, but also financially profitable. But capturing things like these small blogs where people like were just talking to each other in really interesting ways is not that profitable. We end up losing because we did not digitally capture what was going on. And so I struggle with whether or not it is appropriate to just hold on to those digital elements outside of context, or whether it's more important to take an ethnographic approach to actually studying record. Because there is something that's really deeply problematic to me about holding digital items outside of context and what not, especially. The reason I said I wouldn't make my archive public is that I was there in the blogosphere while these conversations were happening. A lot of these folks have some good jobs now, right? Like they're writing for the New York Times, they have bestsellers, and some of the stuff they were saying 15 years ago would not go well for their careers in the present. But the context is really important of why they were saying that then and how what they think changed and how their writing changed. And you can't capture that by simply digitizing that and leaving it available and open to everyone. So I don't have a clean, easy answer for it, only to say I think it's incredibly complex and incredibly incumbent upon us to be deeply committed to context and history and to the folks we're writing about and for.
Next question, please. Y'all, all y'all who teach know that y'all hate it when your students do this to you. Daniel, yes.
First of all, thanks so much for your talk, and I love the historical sweep of it, and I love the through lines through thinking about technology and context. I was just really wondering if you could say a little bit more on the fundamental points that you made about Twitter and how context really matters on Twitter. And especially, I think, like sort of for broader framing, is that we have a lot of people who do research at varying scales on Twitter within this center. And I love the ways that you were teasing out the problematics of really coming to understand that, like, Twitter contains multitudes, right? And like, I love that basic point. I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about what sorts of questions or collaborations or frameworks we need to really sort of think that through in a way where we can both zoom out but also zoom in and be faithful to context on both sides.
Thank you for that question. It gives me the opportunity to say that, like, I want no beef with the big data stuff. No, I really appreciate big data analysis for what it does, and I hope folks appreciate my work for what it does and recognize that they do different things. They answer different kinds of questions. Like, I'm a big proponent of the question guides the method, right? And in this case, I was deeply interested in the context, in the relationship that people had with their tools, which was incredibly difficult to capture through a large-scale study, right? It required time, right, for me to see things change on one singular account. It required me to see how people interacted with different kinds of users on different days. It required me to see the kind of spacing that they used or the font size that they chose in a blog, right? Things that are really hard to pick up on with certain tools that we have access to. I'll give you one really quick example of this, which I wrote about a little bit in the book in the section on publication and Black women's relationship with publication is Jamila Mew was one of the folks that I wrote about in the text, and she previously has been an editor for Ebony Magazine. She's a writer, she's a pundit, she's pretty well known, great writer. And I've been following her career for a long, long time. And there was a tweet that she wrote one day that a mutual of ours had published a book. And she said, without any context, she said, it's crazy that people I edited for are getting book contracts before me, like that, right? And there was no hashtag, there was no like, I'm talking about this or I'm talking about that. I knew exactly what she was talking about when she tweeted it because I had just seen him announce his book, right? And so I was like, ooh. But I also knew that there was no beef between them. There was no hatred there. These were friends. And this was a genuine outcry of like, I have edited all your favorite writers, right? Was kind of the statement that she made. And it's just a fact. And all of our favorite writers had gotten these book contracts out of their blogs, and she hadn't yet. And she deleted that tweet. And I didn't know about it until I was getting ready to publish the book, because I saw it when it happened and I made a note of it in my little journal, right? And I kept notes of it. And then when I was looking for the link to it to like do my proper due diligence before the book came out, I couldn't find it. And I was like, I know she wrote it. I wrote it down on this date at this time that she wrote this tweet. And it left me this moment of like, well, can I publish this? She deleted this tweet. She doesn't want folks to see that she tweeted this. And it's the only tweet that made it into the book that is a deleted tweet. Everything else was there at the time of publication. And I wrestled with it for a long time. And I sent her the chapter before the book came out. In here that needs to come out, you let me know. And she didn't object to it. And I think part of the reason that there was no objection was that the context was present. That if this had been the case where I had scraped and gotten a bunch of stuff and had no idea where it came from and listed this as an example of people like hating or canceling each other, right? That would have been very different from the long years of context that led up to me writing. Actually, in this case, she's like really celebratory of these folks, but is really mad at the publishing process, which says that like Black women are only useful in so much as the labor that we extend to helping other folks' careers, right? That's the point she's making. But how do I know that? It's from the deep amount of context. And so in this case, I would say that the topic that I'm writing about, that the questions I had lent themselves to this method. But I am deeply appreciative of folks who do the larger scale work that makes it possible for certain questions to emerge for me, right? That I can see what kind of work is happening at such a scale that I can zero in on this one small piece and have something interesting to say, hopefully, about it. And I think there needs to be a lot more of that kind of cross-collaborative work where we see each other's work as intrinsically valuable, that we understand that different questions provoke us toward these different ends, and that we don't try to make everything fit where it doesn't, right? There are some questions that I raise and I'm like, I don't know how to do that. I should find somebody who does, or I should lean into someone who actually knows how to do statistical analysis and didn't just skate through that class in grad school, right? That this is a way for us to work in tandem and have similar interests, but have different skill sets. So yeah, I didn't do that for this text. Is it possible that at some point in the future it would be a part of my work? It's a part of what I teach. You know, I teach folks to use these tools. I teach folks how to scrape the web, and I just don't. My questions don't often lend themselves to that method of gathering data.
Thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate, as a big data person myself, I really appreciate the answer that you gave there. Other questions, Muxab?
I meant to say earlier, thank you so much for writing the text. I haven't put it down since you published it, and I'm so happy that I get to use it while I'm writing my dissertation. But one of the concepts that I've been kind of wrestling with is your idea of shop talk and how it's this like enclave communicative strategy. So I wanted to know, since it's like, I think your definition provides like the affirmation of like certain lived experiences, having that background, but without that interference of like the wider public. So can shop talk exist on, or is shop talk specific to certain platforms? Because I'm trying to use it for like a hashtag on Twitter. That's a very public platform. And I know you've done work on like blogs and stuff, so.
Yeah. So that's a really good question about whether or not you can like kind of transfer it between. I originally started writing about Shop Talk while talking about the blogosphere. And I wrote about it with the blogosphere because it was, to me, the clearest through line from like the beauty shop to the blogosphere, because it was like this actually crafted space, right? Like blogs were like, I've got this little area over here, and anyone who wants to come over here has to understand what we're talking about, has to engage in this, right? Which is different than the affordances of Twitter. But what I would say about Twitter, and we shouldn't relegate Twitter, like Twitter's just this public place. We all know about private conversations that happen in public on Twitter, right? We've probably all engaged in them. And that's why I think the context is super important, because you can very easily say like, oh, well, it happened on Twitter, so everybody could see it. Everybody doesn't see everything that happens on Twitter. I'm often shocked at what people describe their Twitter page as looking like on days when mine is like lovely and hilarious, that they're engaged in this like war for their lives when they open up Twitter. And so we can cultivate spaces within these platforms that allow some of the features of an enclave to be present. I think that Sarah Florini writes about this notion of like oscillating publics, right? And the idea that folks move between platforms with different kind of goals and orientations. I think Squire's work still works within that context. So we can think about how we can, and I think it works when we think about our communicative strategies as rhetorical practice, right? That like there are moments at which Twitter occupies the space of a counterpublic because of the rhetorical strategies that are being used there. But I think there are also moments where it occupies the space of something like an enclave because of the rhetorical strategies. I'll go back to that Jamila Mew tweet. There's no hashtag. How do I know who she's talking about? How do I know what the context is? Because she has a group of followers that know her writing style, that know who else she follows, that know who our mutuals are. And so that when something happens, I can make inferences about what's going on, and I can comment on it and be confirmed. And people might view it. It's very possible that someone else might see that conversation and have no idea what's going on. And this, I think, replicates, a lot of those kind of small, we sometimes call them sacred spaces within marginalized publics, like churches, like barbershops, right, that have open doors. Anyone can come in, but anyone cannot understand what's going on there, right? And so you can step foot in a Black church space, and if you've never been in one, some things are going to feel weird, and you're not going to understand some of the calm response. You're not going to understand some of the calm, and you're not going to get it. And the point isn't to keep folks out always, but sometimes it is. Sometimes the point is to develop discursive strategies that are insulated. And especially as it relates, we think historically for Black folks, that's a survival mechanism because our whole lives are lived publicly, right? Hurston writes about the absence of the concept of privacy. Black folks have never been afforded the sense of privacy in this country, that everyone's always watching. So what do? We develop discursive patterns in semi-public or public spaces that still function with the high context that's necessary. So I think it's possible to write about Twitter in that way, but I think you have to be deeply attuned to what the affordances are that people are making use of and whether or not they're being successful in it, and whether or not they're able to kind of keep that insularity that would be necessary, like making it as an enclave.
Thank you very much. I think I saw Maggie's hand up. Question.
Thank you so much for this talk. This is really interesting, and I learned so much, and I feel like I'm still processing lots of the ideas. And kind of speaking on the note of privacy too, I was really curious about how to phrase this question. So when we think about the archive, something that I've thought a lot about recently is just the mass proliferation of images into the archive where there really wasn't before, and like how much more just like visual culture is happening, how many more images there are out there now, and how that's a part of the archive that just wasn't present. And yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. You mentioned before the 3 different images, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, like how different they are, or like I also noticed the way that you juxtaposed the images in your slides. It was really nice. I really appreciated that. So just any comments or reflections you have, I'm really interested.
Yeah, I mean, I'm increasingly interested in in video content, in multimedia content online, primarily because I think it's harder to study, and so I'm kind of drawn to it. I feel like I'm continuously drawn to the spaces where it's a little bit more challenging to study and it takes a little longer because I'm really invested in the concept of slow work. And so I think that like TikTok, for example, is a really interesting space for me right now because one, like so much content is being produced so rapidly, but it's all visual. And so I'm thinking about how we go about writing about that and how we go about archiving it, or do we go about archiving it, and how much sense making is like required in order to talk about it even a week out from when these images happen. So there was kind of morbid, but I don't know, there was a little girl from Toddlers and Tiara who was like in a meme, and like I don't want to make the face because it's going to be like broadcast, but she makes like a really funny face, and it was like that was the girl. Okay, anyway, so she does this face, but she died yesterday. She committed suicide, and I saw this news article, and I was like, I love that meme, and like that's so sad. That like the meme was about like this kind of happy, like overly happy little kid who was like making a fake but maybe real smile at the same time, and how much pain was perhaps like hidden within that structure, and that people used it for that. They used it to convey that like you have to smile even though it's super awkward, or you have to smile even though things are weird. And now we understand how much pain was deeply embedded in that smile. And so images like that become really interesting to me for how much context and how much meaning they hold for those of us who circulate that image, and what happens to an image like that when we are provided additional context, like she ended her life, right, because of the pain that we were kind of using to supplant our own in that visuality. So again, this is one of those questions where I don't have a clean answer, but in order to accept to say that I find it increasingly important for folks who are willing to do the slow work of looking at visual communication, because it requires us to spend time with images and to cultivate archives in ways that look different than oftentimes what Twitter's API allows us to do, right? Like, so it's not possible in tags to like keep all of the images from Twitter, right? Or like the hyperlinks or whatever. So there have to be folks who are willing to like sift through those images and spend time with them and contextualize them. And what that looks like in terms of producing some kind of archive of them, I don't know yet. I don't know if it's our goal. I don't know if it should be our goal.
Yes. No, yes, you.
We appreciate the attention that you paid to performances, like not only like what is the content of the blog, but like what does the blog allow these Black women to do. So I was wondering if you could talk more about the utility that you find in affordance theory or artifact theory, and like what scholars or whatever like you're drawing on.
Yeah, so I mean the piece of affordances that I think is really important, and it's just Nagy that does it, imagined affordances. I'm not sure if I'm making that. I think it's Nagy, right? Whose idea of imagined affordances I think is really important for this text, which is that, you know, there is within computer science this notion of affordances that are like built in by a designer to apps, platforms, you know, technological systems. And then there's this notion of imagined affordances that really takes into context what users bring to those spaces at a particular time. And that's what I'm most drawn to about the notion of affordances, is this interplay between design and co-creation of users. So how is it that like at a particular moment, Twitter becomes useful in so much as, we can use the hashtag as an example, right? Folks who were on Twitter like in 2008, 2009, hashtags were different than they were in 2012 and 2013 and 2014, and are very different than they are now. There was that moment in between those eras where hashtags were like, everyone was hashtagging like full sentences. It was like the joke was the hashtag, right? But the leading up to that was Black Twitter's use of hashtags, and I'll say like Florini's work on signifying, right? Brock's work on signifying practices, Meredith Clark, right? Lots of folks who have written about how Black folks took this affordance that's built into the platform, right? Everyone could use the hashtag, and did something so different with it that it became the standardized norm of how we use hashtags. It was not what it was designed to do. Like, the hashtag was not supposed to be the joke. It was an organizing principle, right? It was like a mechanism to like find and search, right? And then it became Paula's Best Dishes, right? And it became, you know, all of these different kinds of hashtags that we use in order to not just organize, but to create and to signify and to create new meaning onto things. And so I think imagined affordances is really useful because it requires us then to think about who's using the platform and the historical context in which they're using it. And therefore the affordances of Twitter, even if the platform itself doesn't change, actually do shift between 2009 and 2019. Right? What we see ourselves as able to do in that space shifts. Facebook is a great example of this. For those who were on Facebook in the like, you had to have a .edu right? And so if you were on back then and your memories still pop on Facebook, like my memories were like, is going to the store is your memory from 2006. It's like, what? Oh, right. That's how we used to use Facebook. It's like Catherine is going to the store. You would just fill in whatever Catherine is doing because Facebook asks you, what are you doing? And so the way we use these platforms shift, even though it's the same post, it's the same mechanism for posting, right? But what I'm expected to do in that space shifts dramatically year upon year based on who's doing what, in what context, and what other tools I have access to. So also what I choose to do on Instagram looks different because I know what TikTok is. Like my Instagram stories look different than they did before TikTok existed, even though there's not a lot of different features for me, right? And so having access to different tools, different contexts changes our relationship and our imagined affordance with the platform.
We still have more time for questions if folks have them. I suppose in one of these typical lulls, I can ask my question, which is one that is a little bit beyond my expertise, and perhaps yours. I don't know. You can tell me. But a lot of what you were talking about really made me think about, and really what I maybe want to ask you if you have thought about any implications that your work may have for policy, both in terms of platforms and possibly also government. And so, in particular, I'm thinking about the way that you mentioned things like harassment, content moderation, appropriation of content, theft, and possible payment for content, that sort of use, and also more generally things like wealth accumulation and distribution of power. So I'm just wondering if that, are there insights that emerge from your work that might help platforms and possibly government also to help Black women and other marginalized groups flourish?
Thank you for that question. It's something that I have been asked to think about more lately. and I say that because at the start of this, I had a reviewer on the book who was like, you need to think about policy. I'm like, I don't want to. I don't want to. Like, I just want to write about like what Black women were doing, and I'll let the policy. And they were like, no, like, you have to do that work. And so thank you for the question, because it's a reminder that I have to continue to do that work. I think that Black folks generally online have served as canaries in the coal mine for a lot of what we see happen next more broadly with society and digital technology. I think that's like the very easy answer to that that's not very satisfying, is that like we've watched like post 2016, like post Ferguson era, moving into the summer of 2020, we watched like Black organizers flee platforms, right? Like leave spaces in fear after 2016 of their data being collected, of this like real serious understanding of what surveillance looks like because they were experiencing it on the ground, and also were understanding that it was going to happen on Twitter, right? And so there was like this mass exodus of organizing, of out loud, in front of everyone organizing on these platforms that people had been like praised for before. And part of that was, this fear of surveillance. I think part of that also was the understanding that doing organizing work in front of other folks makes it not organizing work in the same way anymore, right? That like these platforms are meant to be profitable, and the relationship that you had to form with profit in order to get the blue check or to get more followers or to get more people reading your work was taking away from the ability to do the things that they wanted to do on the ground. And so like that was one way I saw during the writing process of the book this play out, and then other folks started doing the same thing, right? So it really started with Black organizers and then moved into everybody like, oh my God, the surveillance. Like I just saw folks start tweeting, oh, if you have a period tracking app, you need to delete it from your phone, surveillance. And it's like, we've been telling you that they're watching, right? Like the bots that were designed to mirror and mimic Black folks during the election in order to shift dialogue in certain spaces and to try to convince people to vote in different ways. Like we've been telling you that this thing is going on, that like Black folks online have been trying to raise alarm bells about what possibilities and what constraints there are to these platforms, that they can only do so much, that they are not these wonderful public spheres where democracy flourishes. Been saying that for a long time. And so, I mean, I think what I hope, instead of me figuring it out, is that there are much more brilliant graduate students who will take this work and will do that. I mean, my hope is that they will think more about what is happening next. Someone asked me a couple weeks ago, like, is there going to be a part 2 to like digital Black feminism? Because you kind of stopped like before the TikTok era. I was like, not from me, but I really hope somebody recognizes the next turn before it happens, right? Like that someone sees the next turn, what that looks like with Web3, right? Like what I hope someone understands that and studies that and understanding and can point us toward potentially better policies in that era.
Any other questions before we wrap up? All right.
So in my own work, I thoroughly enjoyed your text, and I think that for the question that I'm, like you were saying, the questions that you asked determine the method that you're using. I read Professor Brock's book, and in his text he does talk through Black cyberculture, but then he does spend a considerable amount of time looking at white technoculture, which you sort of contrast as like digital Black feminism as the undoing of the white technoculture. I guess how, or would you suggest in the question that I'm asking, kind of rely on, like, I guess white technoculture has to be not central, but it has to be like understood as the sort of way that we understand technology in order for me to even ask or pose the question that I'm asking. So how can I sort of balance an understanding that white technoculture is a framework that we traditionally use to understand technology, while also making space for a digital Black feminism or a Black cyberculture, which brings about like the Black joy and doesn't rely on like deficient models and understanding Black the use of technology.
I mean, there are wonderful folks who are studying things like problems, right? Whose task is, and the questions that they ask are about problematics. And therefore they have to talk about the problematic ideologies within our society that like make these systems go, right? And this text in a lot of ways talks about problematics, but it doesn't do so by centering the folks who are creating the problematics. And so what I would suggest is that as you think about who you're writing about and who you're writing to, even if it doesn't become the way you end up writing it out, that there is a value in the thought work and the thought experiment of decentering who you think must be at the center. I think that there is valuable thought work in saying, what if I didn't write this from the orientation that this was the center point? What if my understanding of what a technology is was broad enough that whiteness wasn't at the center of it? What if my understanding of technology wasn't limited to the screens and the things that we tap with our fingers? What if my long historical understanding of what constitutes technology actually didn't center whiteness? Because your questions will be more interesting, right? And then that moment where whiteness is centered is so much smaller on the long time frame, so much smaller in the global understanding. But sometimes we're so very hyper-focused on like social media in the period of like, 2014 to the present, that we're like, how could I talk about that without talking about white supremacy at the middle of it? Fair enough. But what if you're talking about technology and technique over centuries, and this 6-year period is but a drop in the bucket? You can think about how we get to this place, and then you can also think your way out of it, because it wasn't always the case. And so I don't know, it doesn't have to change the focus of how you write or what you're writing about, but I think the thought experiment is always valuable to place something or someone else at the center than what the assumed norm is that should be positioned there.
Thank you very much for this very excellent talk and all of your, the way you answer those questions, I'm really just trying to take notes in my head. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you who joined us today. This does conclude the spring speaker series from BCaT. If you would like to continue to follow more of Dr. Steele's work, I'll just say one last time, the book is Digital Black Feminism. And if you haven't bought our own copy, probably well worth a read.
I think that NYU Press is still doing this like 30% off thing, so
there may still be a discount.
There might still be a discount. It was still 30. Try it. I don't know.
And it looks like you have an active Twitter account. It looks like your research laboratory, BCaT, it has a Twitter account. There are ways to keep in touch with your work. If you'd like to keep in touch with ours, we are at UNC_CTAP on Twitter. We are at ctap.substack.com for a newsletter. We are on the web at ctap.unc.edu. To try to conclude some of your wishes about labor, I will include a shout out to our graduate research Andrea, who's in the room and did in fact make postering happen. I trust. And the many sales staff who do in fact keep all of the other administrative plays. Thanks so much to